Well, Jeff Fuller with you, Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can certainly like, share, subscribe. We're also the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews on Apple iTunes and Google Podcasts. We believe people's stories make us better if we will just simply take the time to listen, unlearn what we thought was right, to relearn what is right. Together, we are certainly not just better, but more informed and make a greater impact. And one with a tremendous story. The one, the only, it is Alexander Wolff. Alex, how are you?
Very well, Jeff. Great to be with you on this Monday morning.
Yeah, and so good. Last time that you were on was last year, and we were talking about the last dance with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls, and it's definitely been a crazy 14, 16 months. How have you done this past year and a half?
Well, thanks for asking. I mean, I count my blessings every day, or I certainly did the last 16 months, that you and I and so many of our neighbors and friends live in this state. I mean, Vermont has lots to be proud of about how we came together, and we're at the very front of the parade in terms of protecting ourselves, protecting our loved ones. And it's, if you're a writer, as I am, a kind of enforced introspection, which is what the pandemic visited upon so many of us, can sometimes be a blessing. So I was seeing the finishing touches being put on a book I was working on, and just a lot of intense family time. I think my high school senior age and college age kids might have preferred a little less intense family time when they could have broken free. But I think we all learned a lot of lessons about what's important over the last year and a half.
How long did you write for Sports Illustrated?
I was on staff there for 36 years. I started as a lowly flunky checking facts, and a beautifully written story by someone like Frank DeFord or Dan Jenkins would land thump on my desk, and I'd have to make sure that all the stats in it and names in it were correct. But very quickly, within a couple of years, I was able to move on to write in my own right. And I'd say my time there was kind of divided into two chapters. The first was the Chase the News chapter, where I felt I was kind of at the mercy of events, thrown on the road. Very exciting, especially when you're young. And then the last half was much more spending more time on maybe more substantive stories, do some travel, come home with a full notebook, and then make some sense of it. And Addison County, Vermont is a pretty good place to make sense of a full notebook.
Oh, definitely true. And Alexander Wolff, make some time. I just want to talk about the fact checking. You actually gave those writers credibility because you made sure everything was intact. How important is it that people in general have someone to hold them accountable or to call them on things that might not be accurate?
Well, we're living in an age where there are these ecosystems that seem to have their own firmaments of fact. And I think it's really, really important. And my great fear is that there isn't a kind of neutral arbiter that the vast majority of us can trust. The mainstream media for years was counted on to do that. And there's been so much distrust sown around institutions like the one that paid my salary for 36 years. I do talk to young people who want to go into the business of journalism whenever I can, and try to encourage them and make the case that it's an important calling, that if nothing else, you are kind of setting the terms for the debate. We can disagree, but let's not disagree on what the basic facts are. And so I think it's as important as ever. And when I look around, even in our state here in Vermont, the erosion of just those simple day-to-day news outlets that you could count on, how many reporters are actually in Montpelier covering the State House now? Right. It's, people are still getting their news, and we may be going through a kind of shakeout period right now for the next 10 years or so, where there's a migration from the traditional platforms to new ones. And I'm not a snob about that. I think let a million platforms bloom. I love that. But, let's invest with our trust and our support those that are really doing the honest job, I think would be my lesson. That's what I tell young journalists.
That's really good, and such wisdom that you bring to the table, and I admire. And I just think of the interview that you had with Jeff Pearlman. Jeff graciously has come on my show a couple times, and I really enjoyed Jeff. He has his own opinions, but you can have a conversation with him, which I really enjoy. But something that stood out to me, and I believe now, yeah, I'm second guessing myself. But you talked about how you'd be put on a story about like the red hot Red Sox winning 6 in a row. Then you travel up to Boston, and then after the issue comes out, they go on a 3-game losing streak. How frustrating was that for you to put in so much work and effort? Then after the issue comes out, just law of averages, then things didn't turn out, or the hot streak was over.
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned that, Jeff, because I did a cover story about the SI cover jinx, and made pretty much that argument, which was that, yeah, by the time we get around to something that merits being put on the cover, that statistical phenomenon we call reversion to the mean is going to kick in. And the guy who's really at heart, maybe a 280 hitter, who's been batting 555 for the last few weeks and sent us up to Fenway Park to write that story, we put him on the cover. And of course, because he's a 280 hitter, he goes into an 0 for slump. Yeah. And we look silly, but that's the game. And I do think one of the benefits of our new media ecosystem is that there isn't this 3, 4, or 5 day gestation period. The metabolism of the news cycle has really quickened. And I guess the flip side of that is there's not as much opportunity to be reflective. And those are the kinds of stories that I loved as a writer writing, and as a reader, I really like. And I know there are people out there who would much prefer to take more time with one story every few weeks than constantly eating these McNugget bites every single news cycle.
It is so substantive to have those. Behind you is a picture of you in front of a barn wearing a Carhartt jacket. And so I have to bring it up for those that are unaware. The Vermont Frost Thieves, AlexanderWolff.com is where you can find this, but his new book, End Papers, we're going to talk about a little bit. How far along were you at Sports Illustrated when you had the thought of making the Vermont Frost Thieves a possibility?
Well, it happened after I moved here with my wife, and we'd had our first child, and actually had our second in 2003. And the web was really starting to become a thing, and there was a lot of agitation in the office. This would have been mid-2000s. We need content. We need to constantly feed the beast that was SI.com, or we were hoping would become SI.com. And I happened to be in Atlanta interviewing the NBA scouting director, Marty Blake, for a story I was working on about him and his amazing life and career. And we just got to chit-chatting. And Marty was very proud about being able to see and at least open up a file on every legitimate NBA prospect in the world. And there was this fly-by-night outfit called the ABA that had kind of reconstituted itself with the good old red, white, and blue ball. And Marty was belly aching to me about how the teams changed so often and moved from venue to venue. He couldn't even get a schedule, so how could he send his scouts to check these players out? And he just, as an afterthought, said, apparently it costs only $5,000 to get a franchise. So something clicked in my head. Oh, $5,000 for a franchise. For that, my employer could pony up, and I could start a team in Vermont. So I got home, I talked to some editors, and then I put a call into the league office in Indianapolis, and it turned out that the market rights for Vermont were very available. And that just led us down the path that led to the Aud and Barry and Memorial and Burlington, and 3 years, and all sorts of memories and achievements. And I'll tell you, Jeff, when I look around the world and when I see a guy like John Bryant, who played 3 seasons for us, and he's on the Bulls bench, and when I see Will Voigt from Cabot, Vermont, as the Angolan team coach and becoming an international celebrity for this defensive innovation he's come up with called the peel switch. Now, the Frost Thieves are still making an impact. And, I know a lot of us still have our sweatshirts and caps and mothballs and all that. And every now and then I smile when I see people around the state wearing them. But, that was the crazy, crazy sequence of events that led to the team.
Now, I have one, I guess, serious pointed question, and that is the Boston Red Sox, I'm told, will always be Boston's team, even though Patriots had great success, Celtics of old. It seems as UVM basketball captures the city of Burlington. Were you kind of surprised that Burlington did not have the response that Barry did?
No, I wasn't. And, Burlington is more of a kind of suburban New England market, Chittenden County. There are a lot of other things competing for people's time and attention. And we were actually kind of lucky that UVM basketball was, they weren't down when we played our 3 seasons, but there wasn't quite as much excitement around UVM hoop. And certainly UVM hockey had kind of gone into the doldrums a little bit. And then I think the real break we caught was the Celtics were in a real down cycle. And then Barry, on the flip side, they were people were just pining for something that they could call their own. And, surely at the demographics, Chittenden County, much, much bigger catch basin of people in theory. And we had more support in Central Vermont, where the numbers are a whole lot smaller, but the passion, our players loved it. I mean, when they stepped on the court at the Odd, they wanted nothing more than to play as hard as they could. And, we did really well. I think we might have had a slightly better record at Memorial, but that's partly because that's like Phantom of the Opera, the shots come out of the rafters, the dark. And I think visiting teams had a really hard time adjusting to playing a Memorial, where the Odd, even though it's kind of high school court dimensions, it's better lit and was a little more easy for visiting teams to get used to.
Now, I was just sharing with you off air that I watched the Team of Broken Dreams piece that you did regarding Yugoslavia and Olympic sports. And so I would like to talk about that in a moment. But with the Olympics possibly, hopefully happening this summer, my question to you is, how much does it mean for those athletes to be able to compete? And with COVID not allowing them to play last year, for the athletes specifically, what would it mean for them not to be able to play or compete?
Just the last couple nights, Vanessa and I have been watching the track and field and swimming trials. And I think that really drove home to me just how much gets put on the line. Just years and years of training, and every single athlete competing in both of those events had their own long and winding road story that led them to that point. And then you throw in that little variable factor of, that a year ago, right now, they were or had been hoping to do the same thing. And their plans got scuppered. And for a guy like Nathan Adrian, the swimmer, who didn't make it, and then Simone Manuel almost didn't make it on the swimming side, certainly. And there are even more stories on the track side. So my heart really goes out to them. If they have to hold the Olympics, in a hermetically sealed bubble just to keep everybody safe, but let the athletes compete. I mean, that they've been able to kind of carry their ambition, their training, their hopes, their dreams over this extra 14, 16 months, whatever it's been. My hat's off to them, and I'll certainly be watching and hoping for the best.
And I think I shared with you last time that growing up in Central Vermont, my parents are, sophisticated Vermonters, I'll put it that way. But my dad never got cable or satellite. He always thought it was a waste of money. So every 4 years when the Olympics happened, Summer Olympics, it was like a kid in a candy shop for me. There were live sports on, and it was just so enjoyable. For you being able to cover the Olympics, did it lose its luster, or did you always understand what these athletes were trying to be a part of and just the atmosphere that you were in?
No, it didn't lose its luster at all. I mean, I think the hardest part about actually covering the Olympics is you can't clone yourself. You can only be in one place at a time. And the great thing about television is, they cut from here to here to here, and you really don't feel you're missing anything. I think just being able to see and talk intimately with some of these athletes in those moments just after they've either done something really inspiring that fulfills a lifelong goal, or conversely, the old agony of defeat thing. And I've seen both sides of it. And I think it's really driven home. You're comparing yourself against others. That's the essence of athletic competition, which means you're going out on a limb, and the risk is there that you can finish fourth. I mean, what's the greatest disappointment in the world is to finish fourth in an Olympics. We had a writer on our staff, Kenny Moore, who was fourth in the Olympic marathon in Munich in 72. And, you can dine out on cocktail parties on that bit of trivia, but it's pretty brutal. So, no, it didn't lose any of its luster. The magic was there. And I think actually physically being at an Olympics, one of the great things for me was always the folding into the place to all the athletic competition, that you had a Barcelona or a Lillehammer or a Sydney or Rio, these places that, certainly in the case of Rio, that were fragile and that, clearly they were almost literally bankrupting their country in order to invite the world to this event, which added a whole layer of poignancy and geopolitics. And it suddenly became more than just fun and games. And as a journalist, I really enjoyed that. It enriched it all and added texture.
Alex, with so much travel when COVID happened, did you realize that you took travel for granted?
I'd have to confess, yes. And truth be told, that was probably the thing that I missed the most, at least immediately, until I settled into the groove of, the blessings counting, as I mentioned before. Here we are in this beautiful patch of the world, and there's more than enough coming. We can stream just about any movie or song, and go for walks with our buds in our ears. I mean, it's how lucky are we here in Vermont? But yeah, no, I've always enjoyed having something kind of over the next hill. And for years at SI, it was an assignment. And frequently it was some exciting one like the World Cup or the Olympics. Yeah. And just not being able to book a train trip down to New York to catch a show and meet with editors or grab a bite with friends. And now I'm trying to make up for lost time, as you might imagine.
Hey, as I alluded to before, on YouTube, there's a piece about Team of Broken Dreams. How were you first made aware of that story, or decided to cover that Yugoslavian team that was split up?
Yeah, it was back in the late 80s. You could see the first stirrings of international basketball affecting U.S. basketball. There were a handful of good overseas players who wound up at U.S. colleges, and I would run into them. And then guys like Šarūnas Maršalonis came over from Lithuania, and the Atlanta Hawks took that famous tour of the Soviet Union. And you could see, particularly from that part of the world, the Balkans, that these weren't just big players who were going to fill out a roster. These were guys who were really well schooled, who had a variety of good fundamentals, passing and shooting, particularly. Just because you're 6'10 or 6'11 didn't mean you couldn't play in the open floor. And that was the direction that the game was going in. So I was pretty quick to carve out a niche at the magazine as sort of the international basketball guy. And I ended up meeting this coach who features in that video, Svetislav Pesic, who had been the coach of the Yugoslav national junior team back in 1987 when they upset a really good U.S. team at the World Junior Championships. And of course, between 87 and 91, 92, when the Balkan Wars break out, a lot of historical water has flowed under that bridge. And it just struck me as a really poignant way to tell readers about this thing that's on the front pages of newspapers, but hasn't really been humanized. Because so many people who watch basketball will recognize a Toni Kukoc from a Bulls game, or a Vlade Divac from a Lakers game, or a Dino Radja from a Celtics game. And here, there's this whole part to them and where they're from that can be illuminated. So I went to editors and said, I'd really love to do this story in advance of the 96 Atlanta Olympics, because Serbia wasn't going to be there. And the Dream Team in 92 might have been threatened by a united Yugoslavia, maybe threatened as in lose by 10 or 12 instead. So it became something that not only worked for the magazine, but then I knew the guys who had done Hoop Dreams, Steve James and Peter Gilbert, and they got all excited. And NBC wanted to do a pre-Olympic special with SI, so we very quickly slotted that in. And it was great fun to work with those guys on that story.
Alex Wolff, thank you so much for sharing that. That was just fascinating. And it took me back to when I graduated high school in 93. So it was right around that time, just watching sports and hearing the different stories and seeing in the draft and not recognizing the names because, well, they weren't from North Carolina or Kentucky. And I was like, who are these players coming in? But it was just fascinating. Instagram, it's awolf24. On Twitter, it's Alexander_Wolf. And I want to transition. And I have to admit that on Amazon Prime, there's a TV show called Hunters, I believe. And it talks about how some of the SS after the war came to the United States and were employed because they had certain expertise. And it was very interesting, kind of fascinating, certainly entertaining. But then I came across your book, End Papers, and there's such real life history, not just entertainment. Can you just talk about your grandfather in particular and then what led you to writing End Papers?
Yeah, Jeff. So this book really is about my grandfather and my father. And here I am right through that patrilineal line, looking back at those two generations of these male forebears. So my grandfather was a publisher back in early 20th century Germany. He published before World War I, published Franz Kafka, among other writers. And then World War I hit, and Germany was suddenly changed in the aftermath. Its economy was changed. And as the world would come to know in horrifying detail, the very, very nature of the German state would turn into this monstrosity. And the kind of publishing my grandfather did, you know, the kinds of writers that the Nazis disapproved of, let's just put it that way, would fall out of favor, and people weren't buying those books. They're probably afraid to buy those books, many of them. And he, in 1933, shortly after the Reichstag burned, which was that event that led to the immediate rise of Adolf Hitler, he fled. Now, because of a divorce that had happened a few years earlier, my father was left behind in Germany with his mother, who had no Jewish background. My grandfather had a mother who was descended directly from Jews, going back many, many generations. So he had religious reasons also to want to flee the Nazis, in addition to his publishing ones. But my dad's left behind, and very quickly, you know, as you go through the 30s, he goes to boarding school, and he's graduating from boarding school in 1940 and almost immediately conscripted and sent to the Russian front. So the very tidy way of describing this book is a grandfather who fled the Nazis and a father who fought for them. But it's much, much more complicated than that. So what I did upon leaving the magazine in 2016 was I took stock of an enormous trove of letters and diaries, and also secondary sources that described certainly the life of my grandfather, who was a fairly prominent figure. He came to the US and founded Pantheon Books, which became very, very successful after the war. But there was plenty of material there, and I felt almost this obligation to sort through it and tell the story. You know, here I'd chased the sports news week to week to week and had this highly rewarding and exciting professional career. And then sitting in front of me, just kind of asking questions of me, were all these amazing family archives. So my wife and I scooped up our two kids and we moved to Berlin for a year. And the idea was to talk to family members who still live over there and go through archives. The Germans are very thorough. So if you go into a German archive, you can find pretty much anything you're looking for. And then see if I could stitch together this story and also answer a lot of questions that I was starting to have. And I would say a good 70–80% of what's in this book, I didn't know. And my dad was fairly forthcoming if I asked him, but he didn't bring up the war. So just to close that loop slightly. So my grandfather comes over in 41, founds Pantheon Books, almost exactly simultaneously with my dad being on the Russian front with the Wehrmacht. And then the war ends and Germany is a wasteland. Between 45 and 48, my dad is almost literally starving in Munich, living with his mother. And he somehow, because his dad has become a US citizen, gets a student visa to come to the States and study, and that changes his life. He meets my mom, happily ever after would be one way to look at it, but a lot of unanswered questions. So again, the book is an attempt to kind of dig into those unanswered questions.
So a couple quick questions about that. How people maintained a diary, they journaled, they took a lot of notes. Just say in 20 years, your kids want to write a book about your life. Can they go back to your journals, your diaries? Do you maintain some sort of, something that they would have so they can look back and do that? Or is that just kind of a lost art from a time long ago?
I asked myself that very question a handful of times. Goodness, aren't I lucky that I come from a long line of people who wrote and who were pack rats, and everything was analog. Yeah. I guess the only thing, to answer your question, the only thing my kids could go after would be this Filofax, which has nothing more than just appointments in it, like Jeff Fuller, 8 a.m., And so maybe they could extrapolate from that a little more about my life, but I don't know what biographers are going to do unless there's some serious archiving going on, electronic archiving going on. Or people are so conscious of their being important in the sweep of history that they're scribbling down things, or they're putting onto a hard drive or something, their emails and their blog posts or God knows what.
Yeah, I had opportunity. My grandmother, she passed away, several years ago now. She was 93 when she passed away. But when she was in her late 80s, we got her a book, and it just said, share your memories. And it had different highlights of first date or favorite place to go. And I treasure that. She didn't complete it all, but there's enough in there that gives you kind of a look back that I can share with my kids, which would have been her great-grandchildren. And I really feel like you've said before, written word, long form, people, and I'm guilty too. I will listen to a book on audio rather than flip through the pages. Are you concerned that we are transitioning? I mean, I know before you said all mediums, but are you concerned that people aren't reading as much or writing as much?
I'm not too concerned because I don't fight the new platforms. Personally, I don't really do audiobooks, although I've ordered Raj Bennett, the Men in Blazers guy. His new memoir is on audiobook, and I'm so used to hearing his voice. I definitely want to listen to it rather than read it. But I do think that certainly the pandemic bore it out. People are consuming stories as much as ever. I do wish, I see it in my own kids. They read plenty, but it's usually on screens, and it's usually really short bits. It's not these sort of 100,000-word nonfiction narratives that are kind of the staple of the book business. So, I have a little bit of a concern, and things migrating over to podcast series, and people have a finite amount of time, and certainly you and I don't want to consume the same story like on 3 different platforms. We're gonna consume it one time, and I just have this bias for wanting to tell it on the page. Now, I do think that a very personal story like this one works best either audiobook read by the author or, as a memoir as in end papers, we drop the photos in, we have a family tree. It's kind of meant to be consumed as a physical book.
Alex, could you just share a little bit? I know, especially over the last year, people have asked me how I've been doing with just being Asian, living here in Vermont, with everything that's gone on in our country, and has been going on for years. But having that German background heritage, did you run into conflict when you were younger that it was exposed now over this last year and a half of, wow, that wasn't right? Or I just look at that Team of Broken Dreams, how, people should be learning from our past, but instead we're kind of replicating it or duplicating it.
I was very lucky. I was certainly conscious. I went to high school in a very heavily Jewish suburb of Rochester, New York. And there were Holocaust survivors living in our community. And at the time, I was much more conscious of my dad having been in the Wehrmacht than my dad having been a quarter Jewish. And that in theory, if Hitler had won the Second World War, eventually my dad could have been targeted for certainly persecution, if not worse. So that was a little bit more front of mind. But one thing that I've realized in working on the book is the incredible speed with which my grandfather and father assimilated. It's really down to them being white Europeans, and a certain class element too, that there was some family money that somehow survived through the war. My dad married a woman who came from a comfortable family, American woman, my mom. And all that set both my father and grandfather up for real success as Americans. In fact, so my grandfather never mastered English, and here he ended up publishing bestsellers in this language that he never mastered. I mean, that's the American dream, but I can't sit here and say that their Western European, Caucasian, and upper middle class advantages didn't help make that possible. And I think that is probably the thing that most impressed me about Germany, the Germany that I experienced in Berlin, living there, and just watching the way Germans have grappled with their past. Today in Germany, there are no longer alive people who were directly implicated in the Holocaust.
Right.
The vast majority of Germans, in my experience, are just determined to show the world that they've turned the page while never forgetting what was on the previous page. And for that reason, I think there's a great deal we can learn from. And, we know as well as we've ever known that we have unfinished business and kind of reckoning with our past as Americans. And every day we should be cognizant of it. So I take real inspiration. And in some ways, my German past, I think, kind of puts me in this mediating position in a way. I now have dual citizenship. Something I realized as I was working on this book that I was eligible for. And it felt very important to kind of stitch the world together a little bit. It doesn't mean I don't love America. America took my ancestors in and gave them this chance to just flourish. I'm so lucky. But at the same time, I so admire what Germany has done in facing up to their past. And it just seems like the right thing to kind of bind those two things together.
Oh, that's excellent. Well said. I have a question. I was a director of mentoring for almost 10 years, as you're aware. And just fathers involved is an important piece. Your dad and your grandfather, when did they really connect? Was it difficult, or was it just happen really quickly?
I didn't realize until I worked on the book just how profound an estrangement there surely was between my grandfather and my father's sister, who never did come to the U.S. So imagine that, as my dad was when the divorce took place, you're 9 years old, suddenly your dad kind of walks out of your life. Now he's in exile as of 33 because Hitler's taken power. But over summer vacations, you're allowed to go visit him in southern France or in Italy where he's hiding out. And you're just a kid, so it seems kind of exciting, and it was. But then by 38, 39, things really start to blow. By 40, 41, he's fled to occupied France and then escapes through Portugal to get to the New World. And you, my dad, are sent to the Russian front. And that there's resentment about that, there might be feelings of abandonment. I completely understand now, having done all this research. Now, there were a lot of things my grandfather did do for my dad. Foremost among them, helped him get that student visa to come in 48 at a time when there wasn't even a German government yet. It was still under Allied occupation to issue a passport. So my dad was incredibly lucky. His father had become a US citizen by 46. So in 48, he comes, he does graduate work in chemistry, and then goes on to a really prosperous life as an immigrant. It's an amazing story. But again, I am not going to sit here and fool myself into thinking there weren't systemic advantages to my family that made it all possible.
So, Alex, when we talk about people's stories, everyone has one. Somebody said there's a book in everybody because your story is so important. For you, why did you want to share your personal story about your dad, your grandfather, everything that took place in a book for the world to see, all the warts, the wrinkles, the good, the bad, and everything else? Why was that so important to you?
Well, I guess you become a writer or a reporter or a storyteller because you want to kind of impose order on chaos in some way. It's what I do. I'd done it for 36 years professionally at SI, and my time in college, I was a history major. I wrote a thesis and 2 junior papers and did student journalism there. So there's a great deal of, it's just kind of in my DNA, I think. But if you look at one of the first pages in the book, it's the dedication to my kids. And I did want to leave for them just an accounting that maybe they can add to, and maybe someday leave it for their kids. And I do feel that I'm in this position where all the archives are kind of sitting there and moldering away. And before, who knows what the fate of paper is, everything goes digital. And I just felt the clock ticking a little bit. So it almost seemed irresponsible not to tell this story, just because some of it, and I started reading these letters, and some of them are incredibly moving, and they're historical documents and descriptions of being in the bomb shelter of a basement. Really kind of historically important too, even beyond my family. So a whole combination of things. And then, you know how it is, Jeff. It's if you work in the legacy media, you're likely to be either told explicitly or implicitly that, you did great work for us for a long time, but we don't really need you anymore. And I had reached that point. I could see the writing on the wall, and wasn't I lucky that I had this story to tell, and now suddenly had the time to tell it? So all those factors played a role in it.
So launching End Papers in the middle or at the end of a pandemic, how difficult has that been for you? Have you enjoyed doing more social media promotion versus in person, or what were your thoughts? Did you wish, or did you delay releasing it for a little bit?
The publisher decided to forge ahead. They had noticed that book sales had remained strong, even with the advent of the pandemic, and they'd figured out, they kind of hacked the system a little bit on how you promote a book and get it into readers' hands. So they were full speed ahead. So I said, all right, if that's what it's going to be, it's what it's going to be. I'm still hopeful I can do a few in-person events, and the German edition is going to come out in September.
Wow.
So things may start opening up over there. I'm hopeful that maybe that some in-person stuff can be done there, because books, particularly this book, I think there is something very personal about it, and face-to-face about it. And I have submitted to the Jewish Book Council Network, which is a great way for authors of books that have Jewish themes or might be of interest to Jewish readers to go before synagogues or Jewish community centers and talk about these issues. And they, of course, went entirely to remote during the pandemic. So they're all set up to do it that way. But I'm very hopeful that over the next year, that some of those events might be face-to-face. And even in Vermont, although I haven't done anything yet face-to-face, I'm knocking wood.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And man, Alex, thanks so much for making time to share about End Papers. And I do have a copy of it. I just have not been able to make it all the way through, but it is so fascinating, and just it is. And for me, feeling as though I know you, I call you a friend, which we're more of an acquaintance, but it's just awesome to hear your story and just to hear all the things from history that have impacted you and your family. And thank you for sharing that. A question I have too is, with Sports Illustrated, you introduced me to Jack McCallum. Phenomenal. It was awesome being able to interview him and speak to him. As we mentioned, Jeff Pearlman as well. A lot of different figures have come into your life. How do you maintain that respect, but also allow some to grow into friendship, but others just to be respectful, even though you may disagree?
Yeah. Boy, the number of people that I've met, both colleagues and just people I've interviewed or shared a press room with, or a bus at an Olympics going from venue to venue, people from all over the world. I mean, I don't know. It's a mystery how acquaintanceship becomes friendship, isn't it? It's, sometimes it's what you have in common, and sometimes it's what you have not in common. It's just the kind of fascinating. One of my great pandemic balms was this television show on Apple TV Plus called Ted Lasso. about this. Basically, it's Roy Williams. If you know Roy Williams, imagine Roy Williams' personality and Jason Sudeikis, and he's a football coach at Wichita State, and he gets through this bizarre set of circumstances. He's put in charge of an English Premier League team, and it was just such a lovely. I didn't realize how much I needed it. Just the spirit of that show, and it was about trying to understand people of different cultures. But it was about so much more than that. And there's one thing that Jason Sudeikis, as Ted, says at one point in the show. He says, "Be curious. Don't be judgmental. Be curious." And that sums it up. I think in my business, there is such premium frequently put on being judgmental. If you're a columnist, you have to have a hot take. And in fact, what we really ought to be doing, because it will inform our judgments when we are judgmental, is to be curious, just relentlessly curious, and ask the questions and put ourselves in the shoes of others. And that's kind of, if the pandemic has had a silver lining, it's really underscored that. And I'm trying to rededicate, even when I go through all these ancestors of mine who are in these potentially compromised positions historically, how harsh should I be when I wasn't in their shoes?
Yeah.
And let me learn more about what it was like to be in their shoes. And then maybe at the end of that process, you can render a judgment. But that was my big takeaway. That's my pandemic takeaway.
So wise. And again, Alex Wolff, it's AWolf24 on Instagram, AWolf24. There's 2 F's in that 24. And on Twitter, Alexander_Wolff. Hopefully a couple fun questions for you. Was basketball always your favorite sport or first love?
Yeah, I always did love basketball. I think I joke with my parents that when I was little, my pediatrician told my mom at one point that he thought basketball was the healthiest sport to play for young kids, that the helmet sports would lead to broken bones. And somehow that message made its way down to me. And we had in this first house we grew up in, someone had left a hoop over the garage. So it was a way I could amuse myself. I was the firstborn, so I didn't have any younger siblings for a while who could keep up with me. So, and it was a kind of a magical time for basketball as I was growing up during the 60s and early 70s. College basketball was about to explode after the whole UCLA dynasty. And I grew up in New Jersey right between the 76ers, not last night's 76ers, but much more impressive 76ers. And then the Knicks in 69-70 winning an NBA title. So it became very much a part of what I loved. I enjoyed tennis and baseball and pro football too. And I've come around to soccer big time because it's what my son is really into. But yeah, basketball has been really, really kind to me over many, many decades. And I'll probably be turning to it again in my next bit of work.
So you mentioned the Philadelphia 76ers, Trae Young. What can you say about this young man, Trae Young, who he has a little bit, maybe it's arrogance, maybe it's confidence or showmanship. It made me think of Reggie Miller, and probably because what he did for or against the New York Knicks. But Trae Young being so young, and he shot terribly last night until the fourth quarter, hit a couple shots. Some of these young players having that confidence, is that just professional sports, or what do you have to say about players like Trae Young?
I've been kind of struck at how quickly the new guard will take over in the NBA these days. It seems like, I mean, just think about it. The 4 final teams here in the playoffs include Phoenix. I mean, how recently was Phoenix at the bottom of the heap? The Clippers, who are perennial punchline, they're the 2 teams that one of those 2 is going to be in the NBA Finals. Right. And the Hawks, I mean, yeah, the Hawks they've been kind of knocking at the door, but then they kind of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of syndrome. So I don't know. I was struck by one thing that they caught, TNT caught Nate McMillan saying in the huddle last night. And it was attack. They can't guard you. Attack. And that is such a young player's mantra. Yeah. And all props to Nate McMillan, who's not a young guy. I used to cover him in college, and I'm an old guy now, so I can tell you. But but that was so wise, because that's how you untap that enthusiasm, that kind of confidence that you have no business having, which is sort of what Trae Young's all about right now. And yeah, it just seemed that there was the Sixers were playing not to lose, and Atlanta had the attack mentality. And, you know, right down to that moment where Gallinari got his hand in there and knocked the ball away from Embiid when he was trying to do that spin dribble, you know, to the first mover, you know, to the bold, fortune is going to come in and reward. So that was my takeaway. And Trae Young is a great example of that.
And I almost wonder if the NBA is going through a transition, just like when Jordan left, you had a bunch of guys, you had kind of Iverson taking over, and then you had Kobe, obviously, and now with LeBron aging, it's just going to be different. And I do love the NBA. It is what it is, but these guys are phenomenal athletes. Hey, so on that same line, who is the most famous basketball player that you interviewed, or the one that you most enjoyed? Whether was it Michael Jordan or Charles Barkley? Who comes to mind when you think about NBA guys that, wow, they've really made it?
Well, you just mentioned the two names. I mean, the thing I most enjoyed about Jordan was having interviewed him when he was just a humble sophomore at the University of North Carolina. And I mean, as humble as you can be when you've won the national championship in the last game of your freshman season. But he was humble in that he wasn't yet this Nike brand. And even his rookie year with the Bulls, I did a story on him that fall when it was clear he was going to be a breakout star. And in talking to him, he actually said one of his goals was to play in at least one All-Star game. I mean, can you imagine the Michael Jordan of The Last Dance saying something like that? But that's sort of one category. It was more about when I interviewed him, because it was very hard to get any interview time with him during Last Dance days. But then Barkley was certainly the most unforgettable and fun. I was very lucky. I was one of the first national writers to do a story on him when he was at Auburn. And even then you could tell that there was something going on with him, the way he interacted with people, the magnetism. He was almost single-handedly making basketball viable on a football campus. And I think that the moment I knew that he was going to jump the shark was pregame when Auburn was playing at Tennessee, and the Tennessee student section arranged to have Domino's deliver a pizza to him pregame in the layup line. And it wasn't just that the students did that, but Barkley totally played along with it. And that's, I think, has always been the key, is that Charles, as much as he pushes the boundaries, he's never been too proud to allow himself to be the butt of the joke from time to time, which takes the edge off that bullying side of him that occasionally surfaces. Endlessly fascinating. And I think one of the things about the NBA that you pointed out about how we're in this kind of transition between superstars, because the game has gone so much to the drive and dish and kick out for the threes, and at the control of every game now is some little guard. I think that's really helped the NBA, and fans of all stripes can really relate, because most of us look like Trae Young or Steph Curry, and that they can dominate games just with skill and shooting range and moxie and fearlessness. And who doesn't want to tune into that? So, yeah, LeBron is an amazing physical guy, and so is KD and Joel Embiid. May he bounce back from last night. But I got to say, the Trae Youngs and Steph Currys, just like the JJ Bareas, who were kind of in that first vanguard, I just love those guys. And I think most fans do too.
So I asked Jack McCallum this question, and if you had to pick in their prime, Charles Barkley or Karl Malone, who would you select?
Probably Malone, because if I'm a coach or a GM, I'd say he's probably, I'm not up late at night worrying as much. And one thing about Malone that I will always two things about Malone I'll always remember. He was in tears on draft day, and he was a 50% free throw shooter in college who wound up an 80% shooter in the NBA. And I think those two things are related. Or they're two pieces that make for a whole. So the tears on draft day are kind of acknowledging his humble origins and how unlikely it was, how hard he had worked to get to that point. And then the 50% to 80% from the line, how he improved, is how I'm going to keep working. It's not over. I'm just going to get better. And I think those two pieces really tell you all you need to know about Karl Malone. Now, that is no slight on Charles Barkley. I would more than anything love to spend time in his company. But in terms of actually managing or coaching him, it might be an endless challenge.
Alex Wolff, AlexanderWolff.com, just affording us some time talking about the NBA, and I love that, but we just want to talk about his newest work, End Papers. Make sure you go out and buy that, whether on Amazon or from his own website, AlexanderWolff.com. But Alex, we thank you so much for being a part. I do consider your insight and wisdom invaluable, and something that I always key in on and learn from after we talk. And so just thank you so much for being available and sharing your story. So thanks again. It's
always a pleasure, Jeff. And you are the master of the screen share. That is a skill that the pandemic still hasn't taught me. I'm really impressed. No, it's always a pleasure. We touch on so many interesting topics, and till next time.
Hey, thanks so much, Alex. Again, Alex Wolff on Twitter. It's Alexander_Wolff. That's 2 F's. And on Instagram, it's AWolff24. We thank you all. Jay Fuller Interviews. Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And now the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews on Apple iTunes and Google Podcasts. Thanks all.